9 November 1990. Bonn. Carl Becker, 77, writes in a small-lined notebook, "They thought paper cannot bleed. Today the ink stains everything it touches." Short sentence. Dangerous sentence. Not one he could have written in 1947. Not one he could have said aloud in 1955. He writes it because someone else turned a key. Someone else turned a key. Someone else opened a cabinet that had been shut for 4 decades. Someone else found the papers the post-war state had folded away and placed behind a door labeled Ordnung und Sicherheit. The cupboard had a smell of dust and old glue. The cupboard held files with names. Names bled across pages. The cupboard had been hidden for reasons named in coded lines: Sicherheit, Stabilität, Geheim. The rest of the story lies between that key and that ink. It lies in rubble and ration cards. It lies in Spruchkammer verdicts and expulsion lists. It lies in displaced persons registers and in files stamped Vertraulich. It lies in the arithmetic of what a city could hold: rooms, rations, jobs. It lies in the mathematics of guilt and the bargaining of memory. The key turns in Bonn, 5 November 1990. The archivist's hand was steady. The key fit like a statement into the lock. She turned it slowly. Her name was Anna Fischer. She was 34. She worked in a low-ceilinged room in the Bundesarchiv building on the Rhine. She had grown up in Kassel. She knew paper. She knew that paper keeps a shape. She also knew that paper hides what people do not wish to see. She had been clearing a set of cartons from a ministry deposit slated for declassification because reunification required inventories. She found a metal cabinet behind a false panel. The cabinet had no shelf list. It bore the hand of a man who had been careful in 1954 and careless in 1961. The lock turned with a dry sound. The first file she opened had a title in faded pencil: BEARRADE, Kriminallanzeigen 1945-1953. Inside were interrogation reports. Inside were index cards. Inside were notations in a different hand, one that read, "Aus politischen Gründen, einziehen." For political reasons, withdraw. Here was a memo from 1952. Nicht verfolgen, Stabilität vor Recht. Do not pursue, stability before justice. Here were letters from 1951 from a provincial ministry to a U.S. intelligence liaison. Ehemalige Angehörige der SS werden für Zwecke der Ostaufklärung benötigt. Former SS members will be needed for purposes of East intelligence. The cupboard held files from 3 zones. It held files with German stamps. It held Allied intelligence summaries and Bundesarchiv records and letters addressed to the Kanzleramt. It held the thin paper of witness affidavits signed with shaky hands. It held some typescript lists with columns: Name, Dienstgrad, Tatbestand, Empfehlung. Some recommendations read: Empfehlung, der Einstellung der Verfahren, suspend proceedings. Other notes read: Zurückgestellt bis politische Lage klar. Deferred until the political situation is clear. Anna took notes. Her handwriting was neat. She wrote the dates and the file numbers and the first lines of paragraphs that astonished her because of their bluntness. She called an older colleague. The older colleague whispered at first, then spoke louder. He said the files had been lodged in 1956 by the Innenministerium. He said they had been omitted from catalogues. He said that the files were not unique. He said that the files were not unique. He said, they thought paper cannot bleed. Karl had called the Bundesarchiv a week later. He lived in Essen. He had been an ordinary municipal clerk between 1946 and 1961. He had carried ledgers and ration cards and lists of displaced persons. He had written reports that said things he now read with a different stomach. He had taken a job promising service and stability. He had been classified in 1947 as a Mitläufer. He had been allowed to return to his desk in 1949. He had married in 1949. He had 2 children. He had a small garden. He also had a file that bore his name. Now, in the autumn of 1990, as Anna read, as the press learned what she had found, the file bore different ink. The cupboard was not an Italian armadio della vergogna. It was a German schrank de Schande. It played the same role. The cupboard had become a hinge. The hinge swung the past into a present that was not prepared. April 1945. Essen. Rubble, the missing, the arithmetic of food. Essen was a ruin. The Ruhr had been attacked for months. The great steelworks smoked no more. The city had been cut into pieces. Streets were blocked. Tremor piled like anonymous altars. Women worked with sledgehammers. They were called Trümmerfrauen. They had the shovel marks of winter and of rationed lives. They carried masonry in canvas sacks. They carted what could be reused and left what could not. They were measured in hours and in the mathematics of food. There are documents that record these hours. There are occupation reports that show the municipal offices counting mouths. There are ledgers with columns for Brot, Kartoffeln, Fett. They list daily rations, 200 grams of bread for adults in 1945, less in winter, sometimes none. There is a ledger, Municipal Register, Stadt Essen, 3 May 1945, that lists missing persons by name, last address, presumed death or evacuation. There is a note in a coarse hand, Familie Becker Vermisst, say 10:30:45. Mutter auf Evakuierungsliste Königsberg. The arithmetic of absence. The Allies came in patrols and columns. The first British reports in the Ruhr speak of curfews. British occupation reports, April-May 1945, record the imposition of strict curfew between 20,000 and 05,000, restrictions on movement, the mandatory handing over of weapons, the registration of local officials. The reports also note a continuing fear among the German populace of reprisal attacks on individuals accused of SS activity. The same reports contain population expresses anxiety, many addresses empty, rumors of execution squads. The first winter after the end of fighting was cold. The winter of 1946-47, often called the Hunger Winter, brought frost and the arithmetic of ration cards. Germany in 1946 recorded food consumption in a way that looks like a ledger of survival. The mathematics of food were brutal. A family of 4 with 2 children in Essen could be allotted a ration permitting 700 grams of bread per day in July 1946, then reduced in December. The municipal office issued ersatz ration cards because cards were lost in bombing. Complaints were taken and recorded. 26 December 1946, hunger complaint from family K. The black market answered. Cigarettes became currency. 1 cigarette would buy a potato. 2 would buy a potato. 2 would buy a portion of meat. The occupational report from the U.S. military government in December 1946 noted, cigarettes are being used as currency in local transactions. They serve as payment and as bribe. There were private voices. Carl wrote in a small notebook to January 1946, "Mother grinds rations this morning." Liza, next door's little girl, takes 2 spoonfuls of soup and steals 1 from Rosa's bowl. People barter. A carton of cigarettes for a sack of coal. The mathematics of hunger reduces people to exchange rates. There was more than hunger. There was loss. The missing were everywhere. The municipal registry listed those who had remained, those who had been expelled, those who were dead, those who were simply gone. The city tried to place refugee families in what little housing remained. A ledger at the Essen Municipal Office, 14 August 1945, lists 1,020 lists 1,200 households requesting a single room to be added because of incoming relatives. The arithmetic of rooms was simple and brutal. Rooms were fewer than people, and each new person sharpened scarcity into conflict. May-December 1945. Occupation, curfew, fear of retribution. Allied patrols took possession of city halls and radio stations. They posted notices. The notices were terse. The language was administrative, but the presence felt like law. All persons surrender all arms immediately. Curfew will remain. All former Nazi flags will be removed. There were Allied orders requiring registration of party membership. There were questions to be answered. There were forms to be filled. The occupation reports are precise and formal. The American Civil Affairs Handbook for Germany advised on denazification, but also on how to keep civil service functioning. The arithmetic of administration was a balancing act between two needs: purge those responsible and rebuild the machine that would run daily life. Reports from May 1945 to early 1946 show occupation authorities with different priorities. The British prioritized order in the Ruhr. The Americans in Bavaria emphasized the removal of top leadership. The French took a stricter approach in their zone. The Soviets in the East pursued mass denazification with a different logic: mass retribution and class struggle. For Germans who had lived through air raids and hunger and the dissolution of the Wehrmacht, occupation meant both security and surveillance. It meant possibility and fear. Karl wrote in June 1945, "Soldiers walk in groups through the markt. They mark houses. Their boots are loud. Some neighbors take down portrait frames. The children stare. At night, rumor says the Gestapo is being hunted. I hear that Herr M's name is on a list. We are all nervous." The mathematics here is of power. Who, among the population of a city, would be judged dangerous? The occupiers had lists. The lists had to be manageable. The lists had to balance the risk of renewed fanaticism with the risk of civil collapse. The mathematics of security were thus also arithmetic of compromise. 1945 to 914. Denazification, questionnaires, the Sprüchkammer, the mathematics of guilt. Denazification was supposed to be a moral census. It became a bureaucratic arithmetic. There were forms, there were Fragebogen questionnaires, long documents that asked citizens to recount their party membership, offices held, actions taken. One such questionnaire, Fragebogen in Your. 1, dated 13 September 1945, asked for name, date of birth, party membership, SS or SA membership, role in organizations. It required details. It also required signatures. There were penalties for lying. The courts of denazification, Sprüchkammern, in the British and American zones held hearings. They categorized people into 5 groups: major offenders, hauptschuldig, offenders, belastet, lesser offenders, minderbelastet, followers, Mitläufer, and exonerated, entlastet. There were Sprüchkammer judgments across the country. A Sprüchkammer in Düsseldorf on 12 March 1948 sentenced a local teacher to 3 years' imprisonment as a belasteter. A Sprüchkammer in Munich in October 1947 labeled an accountant a Mitläufer and imposed a fine. The arithmetic of guilt was counted by verdict and sentence. The system had logic and limits. The Allies wanted to purge highly culpable people, but the scale of complicity was massive. Who, after all, had not benefited from the apparatus? Who had not signed an enrollment form, taken a position in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, paid party dues to avoid suspicion? The questionnaires exposed ordinary choices made under pressure. Many households kept the form answers short. Joined in 1933, no special tasks. Others were more detailed. The Spruchkammer interrogation of a clerk in Hanover, 17 June 1946, shows him writing, "I joined because my boss said, 'Sign or leave.' I was needed. I did the work." The witness statements often repeated the phrase "auf Anweisung," on orders. The mathematics of guilt asks a simple question: who is responsible? The answer the Spruchkammer could give had to be fit to the number of judges and cell capacity and prison budget and political need. The arithmetic of crime in post-war Germany meant sorting millions into categories the state could handle. It meant large-scale triage. By 1948 and 1949, the calculus shifted. The emerging West German polity needed experienced administrators. The economy had to restart. Local governments needed staff. The Allied military governments and the later German authorities grew impatient with lengthy proceedings. There were amnesties, there were reclassifications. A 1949 summary by the British Control Commission noted, "Denazification must end in a form of political stabilization. Overzealousness threatens to remove necessary staff." The report used the word stabilization with a careful economy. Karl's file gives a case in point. He had been a low-level official in Essen in 1943. He had recorded office orders and had taken his pay. In 1946, he filled in his Fragebogen. He answered, "No leadership role, office clerk. Joined NSDAP in 1937 to keep my job." The Spruchkammer hearing in Essen, 12 February 1947, minutes, show the panel deliberated for 3 hours. They discussed his signature on a requisition order that had probably helped requisition forced laborers for local firms. There was no conclusive evidence tying him to violence. The verdict, 21 March 1947, Mitläufer. Restriction, a temporary work ban for 9 months and a small fine. The file would be stamped and then placed in the municipal archive. He was allowed to return to municipal service in 1949, after his restriction ended. His salary returned gradually. The arithmetic of the Spruchkammer was not only legal, it was also administrative. 45% of cases in a particular district might result in Mitläufer classifications. The rest needed imprisonment and could not be sustained politically. The American and British occupation officials had another problem. They wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining leverage. They wanted a West German state that could resist communism. The mathematics of Cold War strategy reduced the algebra of justice to pragmatic calculus. A June 1948 memo from a U.S. advisory board reads, "Where evidence is inconclusive, consider rehabilitation if the individual's skills are necessary for reconstruction and their political reliability can be verified." The arithmetic of stability thus changed the distribution of guilt. It moved the line between categories. It made Mitläufer into future officials. It made exclusion costly. It turned the law into policy. Spring-autumn 1945. Expulsions, the millions come west, the arithmetic of rooms and food. The expulsions from East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania were a demographic earthquake. Between the end of 1944 and the end of 1946, an estimated 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were on the move. They were herded west in winter convoys, by foot, in refugee trains, in small carts. They arrived in towns already in ruins. They carried what they could salvage, a bedroll, a Bible, a child's toy. They carried paperwork and fragments of life. They arrived in the West with legal statuses in debate. Municipal registers are full of arrival notations. A town ledger in Lüneburg from September 1945 lists 3,400 expulsions receiving short-term housing. A municipal clerk in Hanover, 7 October 1945, noted 200 persons lodged in the schoolhouse. They eat at the communal kitchen. There are complaints from locals who lack room. The arithmetic of rooms is mapped like a matrix. A raw town with 20,000 pre-war dwellings might have 12,000 usable units after bombing. Into those spaces, tens of thousands of displaced persons, die della, vertriebenen, arrived. Families took in strangers. A single room could host 6 people. An attic was partitioned with sheets. The municipal officials issued certificates of absorption and maintained lists of Wohnungsbedarf, housing needs. A staff report, Kreis Mettmann, 12 November 1945, reads, "Projected arrivals next month, 4,500. Current vacant rooms, 600. Projected deficit, 3,900. The arithmetic of scarcity was not only physical. Jobs were fewer. The local steelworks had stopped. Small shopkeepers could carry only so many new customers. The displaced enabled economies, cheap labor, an expanded pool, but they also produced tensions. The local press recorded altercations. A letter to the editor, Westdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, 8 March 1946, describes a brawl in a communal shelter over bread allocation. The mathematics of dignity was measured against the arithmetic of subsistence. Accommodation policy became political currency. The newly forming West German parties courted the expellees, the Heimatvertriebene, because of their numbers and because their grievances could be mobilized electorally. The government created the Vertriebenenverbände, organizations that advocated on behalf of expellees. The Bundesvertriebenengesetz 1952 later codified some of their rights. But in the immediate post-war years, the expellees were an urgent social problem. They swallowed rations and room and reframed local politics in the hat of scarcity. Displaced persons. Contact with survivors, the arithmetic of silence. Displaced persons' camps were many. Bergen-Belsen became the best known in the British zone. Feldafing and Ferrenwald housed Jewish survivors and others. The camps were not only shelters, they were political spaces, where victims registered for emigration, where relief agencies counted heads, where memories were made public. The Allied occupation had directives for how to feed and care for DPs. The organizations running the camps documented names, diseases, and testimonies. Occupational reports from the British zone describe the DP camps in blunt detail. They note medical conditions. They note the necessity of providing food and documentation. A report dated 19 May 1946, SOE file, lists 4,000 DPs at Bergen-Belsen, 60% Jewish, 40% other nationalities. Major medical crises include typhus outbreaks. The files contain lists of survivors' names, ages, and their previous place of residence. The lists show towns that had vanished. The camps were placed in geography. Often, they were near German towns. Germans working in municipal offices would circulate near these camps. The proximity made memory difficult to avoid. Some Germans went to the camps to volunteer or to hand over property. Others did not go. For many, the physical presence of survivors was the first concrete evidence of what had been done in their name. For others, the encounter provoked strategies of denial and selective memory. There are oral histories from towns where DPs were housed in schools or factories. A woman in Hamburg recorded in 1950, "I saw them walking on the street with numbers on their arms. They looked hungry. I thought of my cousin who had left in 1943. I did not understand the numbers." A municipal official in Brunswick wrote in his diary 7 July 1946, "There was a meeting with DP trustees. They showed photos. I saw how some local workers looked away." Contact with victims was not uniform. For some Germans, seeing a survivor recounted the specifics, the work detail that had been housed in the factory they now worked at, the forced laborer who had been under a foreman now promoted in a town's workshop. Some interactions were personal. There are interrogation reports, Allied police statements, that record a German shopkeeper being confronted by a former Polish forced laborer about wages he had been paid in 1943. The shopkeeper's report reads, "I did not know. I was only the shopkeeper." The forced laborer responded in a deposition, "You took my money." The deposition shows the arithmetic of accountability colliding with the arithmetic of daily life. Other interactions were institutional. DPs filed claims for property and for reparations. The early Jewish claims were handled by the Allied authorities and by Jewish organizations. The emerging West German state was slow to respond. The first compensation laws were complex and restricted. The arithmetic of restitution had to go through lawyers, proofs of persecution, and often through a bureaucratic system ill-suited to mass suffering. In many towns, Germans assembled a story of themselves as victims. The school memorials and public commemorations of the 1950s and early 1960s often foregrounded bombings and expulsions. The victims who had been persecuted by the Nazi regime were often not central to public mourning. There were some changes. Trials, such as Auschwitz and later efforts, opened public discussion. But for many local communities, the presence of survivors was a disquieting fact that did not easily fit into the accepted narrative of suffering and reconstruction. 1948 to 1952. Currency reform, Marshall Plan, the mathematics of recovery. The currency reform of 20 June 1948 in the Western zones reset the arithmetic of daily life. The Deutsche Mark replaced the Reichsmark and revalued money in a way that wiped out many debts and revitalized markets. The reform was abrupt. It created winners and losers. Municipal budgets had to be adjusted. Housewives found small notes that suddenly purchased more. The black market shrank. The military governments, and later the West German ministers, framed the reform as necessary to end inflation and encourage production. Marshall Plan aid arrived in quantities that mattered. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided economic assistance that rebuilt factories and infrastructure. Steelworks in the Ruhr benefited. A municipal planner in Essen wrote in 1950, "American machinery for rebuilding the blast furnaces has arrived. Employment will rise." The Wirtschaftswunder economic miracle was not a single event but a process. The mathematics of economic recovery depended on investment, labor, credit, and a political environment that allowed former low-level collaborators to keep functioning. Factories reopened. Schools reopened. Families reorganized. The mathematics of growth was visible in rising production numbers and in a kind of social stabilization that made it possible to defer thorny questions of responsibility. Karl found work as a civil servant in 1951. He was assigned to the new Department for Housing Reconstruction in the Essen Municipal Office. His desk was near a small window. He typed lists of accommodation assignments. He signed vouchers for coal deliveries. He learned the new ledgers. His notes from April 1951 show pride in the city's plan and a modicum of relief. More houses go up. The children can run in the street by summer. We are saving money for a radio. He also wrote privately in a notebook on 12 July 1953, "Sometimes the expellees bring stories. An old woman told me of a friend who did not come back from the East. I felt like apologizing for nothing. The new democracy asks for efficiency, not confessions." The arithmetic of economy thus collided with the arithmetic of memory. The state prioritized growth and voting stability. Political leaders argued that an obsession with purges would endanger democracy. The logic of this argument is visible in documents stamped with dates, 1949 through the 1950s. Files in the Bundesarchiv show cabinet notes and ministerial minutes that refer to the need for continuity in civil service and the necessity of utilizing experienced administrators. A 1950 memo from a provincial minister reads, "Some formerly implicated persons have the technical knowledge necessary for reconstruction. Replace, rather than exclude where possible. The mathematics of guilt, who went to prison, who returned to desks. When reconstructing the pattern of responsibility, the numbers matter. There were trials. There were executions and sentences in the immediate post-war period. The Nuremberg trials 1945-1946 were public and juridical landmarks. They dealt with top leadership. They did not, could not, deal with everything. Local courts and Allied tribunals processed others. But as the 1950s advanced, prosecutions contracted. The mathematics of guilt is stubborn. Police files from 1945 through 1955 show tens of thousands of investigations in various zones. Many investigations ended in indictment. A substantial number ended in no further action, insufficient evidence, priority changes, or political intervention. The Allied occupation authorities' own statistics record that in some districts the percentage of cases leading to conviction dropped after 1948. There were sequences of amnesty and reclassification. The Bundestag passed amnesty laws. In 1954, an amnesty law covered many lower-level offences. The law read, "Forgive small crimes where the offender's current behaviour justifies consideration." The law had an arithmetic. It reduced the number of cases requiring resources. A case file kept in the Bundesarchiv, Spruchkammer Duisburg, 1950, shows how an accused foreman who had sent forced labourers to work in dangerous blast furnaces was classified as a Minderbelasseter and received a short sentence. He served it, returned to a job, and in 1952 was rehired by a private firm. The file carries a notation from 1953. Recommendation: reintegration. Skilled labour shortage. The arithmetic was clear. Prison space, the budget for prosecutions, the political cost of alienating skilled managers, each was a variable in a larger equation. The results were not even. The upper leadership was publicly shamed. Middle managers and clerks often returned to their desks. A municipal study in 1952 of municipal staffing in the Ruhr shows that 36% of the pre-1939 staff had been rehired by 1952. The rest were new or replacements. The equation here is, there were also cases where denazification persisted. The public trials of major criminals, such as those at Frankfurt and later in the 1960s, reintroduced accountability. But these were rare compared to the mass of files. The post-war ledger. The cupboard Anna found in 1990 showed, with directories and hand-carved indexes, that many investigations had been eingestellt, suspended, and then sealed. The seal lasted decades. Cold War calculations, intelligence needs, and the suppression of files. The files in Anna's cupboard contained rectangular slips, folded telegrams, and carbon copies of communications between German provincial ministries and Allied intelligence offices. They were the kind of documents one would expect in the bedroom of a post-war secret. Pragmatism. An internal memo dated the 2nd of January 1951 from an intelligence liaison to a provincial Innen minister reads, "Recommendation: do not pursue prosecution of individuals whose knowledge of East German networks may be vital for the coming months. Reassign files to secret archive. C. Label nicht zur Massenfragebar." Another note, January 1954, from a West German ministry to security services. The Gehlen organization has identified several former SS men whose contacts and knowledge of Eastern archives are essential. Current investigations may damage source reliability. recommend deferral. The Gelen Organization. Later, the Bundesnachrichtendienst BND DW Nachrichtendienst BND did recruit former Wehrmacht intelligence officers. There is documentary evidence that the Western Allies also utilized men with Nazi pasts for their knowledge of Soviet systems. A U.S. intelligence summary, 19 March 1949, in a file located in Anna's cabinet writes, "Pragmatic retention of local informants recommended. Their antecedents will be managed administratively." The cupboard's papers show that management meant suspension of charges. It means files stamped with nicht öffentlich and notes claiming für innere Sicherheit. Many of these notes read like arithmetic. How many prosecutions could be conducted without destabilizing the post-war apparatus? How many men were necessary for intelligence, for the rebuilding of a ward, for the production capabilities of a factory that supplied the economy resisting the East? A 1956 letter from a provincial justice minister to the Kanzleramt reads, "We have estates of files. Some names appear repeatedly across districts. The Bundesrepublik's international position would benefit from leaving certain investigations in a drawer." The drawer became the cupboard. This policy had collateral effects. The suppression of files slowed or prevented trial evidence from being used. It preserved careers. It preserved, sometimes, a quiet legitimacy. It also preserved silence. Silence became a structural feature of political life. The cupboard was a physical metaphor. It contained the algebra of paused proceedings, evidence, indicted names, witness statements, yet no movement. Contact, confrontation, and the slow awakening. When the files were read in 1990, they made public a past that had been tucked into administrative closets. The opening of the cupboard did not produce immediate moral clarity. It produced fact sheets, who had been the subject of complaints, who had been protected, who had been used. It produced lists of names that corresponded to old municipal registers. It produced the painful discovery that someone who had signed vouchers in 1943 had, in files, also been recommended for non-prosecution in 1952 for practical reasons. For many survivors, and for their descendants, the revelation was a confirmation of what had long been suspected, that parts of the post-war settlement were built on quiet bargains. For many Germans, the files were disquieting because they showed the gap between public reconstructive narratives and the administrative reality. The cupboard's contents did not alter the fact of practical post-war life, rations, jobs, families, but they changed how past actions were archived and how they might be spoken of. There were moments of personal anguish. A former forced laborer in Poland read a registry that listed his old overseer as entlastet in 1951. He wrote to a journalist in Hamburg in December 1990, "How can a man who beat me be free?" They hid his file. The journalist located the municipal record. The record matched the cupboard's documents. The arithmetic of administrative decisions collided with human memory. The numbers matched the names. Document 2025, Blatt 43. Not all revelations provoked prosecutions. Many of the accused were elderly. Many witnesses had died. The arithmetic of time reduced what the law could do. The German criminal code allowed for murder prosecutions without statute of limitation in later decades, but many cases still required evidence that had perished. A law in 1968 extended the window for Hitler-era murders, but the practicalities remained. In 1990, prosecutors reopened some cases, but these were small in number compared to the list in the cupboard. The legal system had been limited by evidence and by the absence of witnesses. The arithmetics of time had run out for many. Public reaction and political convenience. The paper's exposure produced a public conversation but not a revolution. Newspapers ran lists. Television shows interviewed archivists and victims. The Bundestag received petitions. There were questions of political responsibility. Officials whose names appeared in suppressed memos explained the logic. We had to preserve stability. We had to resist the Soviets. We had to resist the Soviets. There was performative contrition in some quarters. There was also defensive rhetoric. A Bundestag session in December 1990 recorded a minister saying, "We did what we could in a precarious world. Hindsight is easy." Another member of parliament, a descendant of expellees, responded, "The archive shows that many of our present institutions were founded upon decisions that prioritized convenience over truth. The arithmetic of politics is a calculus of risk. For the Adenauer era and for subsequent governments, the risk of destabilization was political and material. The files did not just show individual choices, they showed policy. The cupboard made visible an architecture built to secure a state and to make a West Germany an ally in a bipolar world. That architecture required people who had the necessary knowledge, even if their knowledge came from a past intertwined with violence. There were local consequences. Small towns convened committees, museums displayed documents, families discovered parental names on lists they had never imagined. A 1991 town meeting in Mülheim and der Ruhr produced a municipal archive committee to review names and to reconcile records with public display. Survivors groups organized visits to town halls. Some small reparations and commemorations followed. School books, commemorations, and the arithmetic of memory. Public memory does not form only in courtrooms and archives. It forms in classrooms, in memorials, and in who is asked to speak publicly. School books from the early 1950s and early 1960s simplified the Nazi period. They often presented it as a deviation and an aberration, with heavy emphasis on the Suffet.